Happy National Coffee Day. I'm Emmy. I'm the social media manager at Meetup. And welcome to our Meetup Live event. It's a special edition to celebrate National Coffee Day with Starbucks. Today, we are joined by a Starbucks partner and coffee master, Grey Bryson, for a coffee demo. Grey is joining us from the Starbucks Reserve Empire State Building store. And Grey is going to be showcasing 3 coffees from different regions, teaching you different brewing methods, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end where they'll answer your questions. And just to go into a few guidelines, the video for this event will be recorded, but you will not appear in the video. We have a mute courtesy, so your audio will be muted throughout the entire event. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And there's closed captioning available as well. So to turn it on, click on the live transcription icon at the bottom of your screen and then select your preference from there. And I am so excited to introduce our special guest, Grey Bryson. Grey is a 10-year Starbucks partner and coffee master, born and raised just outside of Seattle, Washington. They started as a barista and they were quickly promoted to supervisor, where they spent the next 8 years between a number of different stores in and around Seattle. Grey then supported Starbucks' Trier Innovation Lab for 3 years before accepting a position on the Global Coffee, Social Impact, and Sustainability team. Most recently, they moved to New York City as a role for the associate manager for the Empire State Building Reserve Innovation Lounge. So welcome, Grey, and thank you so much for joining us.
Awesome, thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Yes, joining from New York City, currently torrential downpour. I made it in, but it is wild outside today, but it's a great day to have coffee. Favorite day to have coffee is to sit in on a rainy day and drink some hot coffee. So that's what I'm going to do for you today. So if we're ready to kick off, I will get going. So I've taught many of these brew demos, and the thing that always seems to show up with the most questions, and I'm going to spend the most time on today and excited to answer questions on later, is going to be the Chemex or any pour over in general. So this is going to be what I'm going to start with today. To begin with, if you've ever used a Chemex, this might have really thrown you off, but the filters are a little crazy. This one's a circle. There's also squares, and you might have been like, how the heck do I put that in and how do I use it? So when you fold it up, it's going to create kind of like a triangle shape. When you open that, there's going to be 3 plies on one side, and then on the other side will be a single ply. The really important thing to do here is to put that 3-ply side against the spout of the Chemex, because that's going to give you a little bit of extra rigidity there, and it's going to keep the filter from kind of closing off the space for air. So as long as we get that set up right, that's the most important thing. It won't stay down very well when it's dry like this. The square one will do a little bit better. The circular one's a little finicky. But the next most important thing, which you may have heard of, is going to be rinsing the filter. This is incredibly important for any pour over or anything that's using a paper filter. Paper filters, they're made of wood pulp like any paper is, and they hold on to a lot of that woody, papery flavor. So rinsing that with your hot brew water is really going to help you remove that flavor. So what I'm going to do here is just pour a little bit of my brew water through it, just enough to get all of the filter that's going to be used wet. And then I'm just going to let that drip through here. So you can see that dripping into my Chemex. It's nice and hot. This is also going to be a great time to heat up my brew vessel. So in this case, it's attached. So I'm heating up the bottom here so it doesn't pull as much heat out of the coffee as I'm brewing. Once this is fully dripped through, the next most important thing to do, which you will probably forget at one point in your coffee brewing life, I forgot literally yesterday brewing coffee at home, but you're going to want to pour out that rinse water. So I have a little dump vessel here. So I'm going to go ahead and pour that out. If you don't pour it out, you're still going to run into the exact same problem I mentioned, where you have a lot of that paper flavor left over, and also you're going to dilute your coffee. So that's something we don't want to do. Once that's all done, now we're ready to really get to the fun stuff. So I have my 45 grams of a coarse medium grind of coffee. You want to go a little bit coarser than you would with a normal pour over. This filter is really thick, and it's going to draw down pretty slowly. So we want to go a little bit coarser than we would for a normal pour over. I'm going to pour all of my coffee in here. The next most important thing is I always brew on a scale. You might have used a scoop before and just kind of estimated water. That's okay. But brewing on a scale is going to give you the most accurate, most repeatable brewing experience you can have. So we always recommend that you brew on a scale when you have one available to you. This one is a little bit on the pricier side. We do offer it at any of our roastery locations. It's by a company called Akaya, and it has one feature that's going to be really helpful in just a moment, as well as a timer. But you can find some timers on places like Amazon and a few other places, or scales that will do you just fine. A standard kitchen scale will work in a pinch. But this one is going to be a really, really nice scale. So as I mentioned, I'm using 45 grams of coffee. I'm doing a 1:16 ratio. So total, I'm going to be using about 720 grams of water. The first thing I'm going to do is, once I make sure that my brew bed is leveled out here, is I'm going to pour my bloom water. You might have heard of a bloom for pour overs before. You might not have, but I'm going to tell you what that is. Essentially, when coffee's roasted, there's a lot of gases that are trapped inside the beans, right? There's oxygen, there's carbon dioxide. There's actually a little bit of carbon monoxide, but it's very small. Don't worry, it's not dangerous. And when water hits the grounds, those gases release really quickly. But when you're pouring water through, this version of a brewing method is called a percolation method, as opposed to a full immersion that you'd have on a coffee press. I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. But here in a percolation, the water is moving through the grounds. All of the water is not in contact with all of the grounds at the same time. So those gases will actually create little bubbles around the grounds and not allow the water to penetrate them fully until the gases have escaped. So the purpose of the bloom is to pour just enough water to allow those gases to start to escape, make that little bubble, and then leave. And then we'll pour the rest of our water to make sure that the majority of our water can do its best job at extracting the coffee. So the amount of water you use for it is not super critical, but in general, you want to use about twice the weight of water as the weight of beans that you're using. So in this case, I have 45 grams of coffee. I'm going to pour about 90 grams of water into my coffee and allow that gas to escape. And I'm going to let it bloom for about 45 seconds to a minute. That's kind of your gold standard for how long you want to let the gases escape. So when I'm ready, I'm going to hit the timer on my scale and I'm going to start pouring. I just want to make sure that I saturate all of our coffee grounds. I have this set up a little high, so it's a little hard to see, but you might want to stand a little bit taller when you do this at home. So that's about 90 grams. Now you can see there's coffee dripping down into my Chemex. And if you could see inside, I coated all the grounds fully. So those gases are starting to escape. I'm going to let it sit for about 45 seconds, like I said. And then when I pour again, if you've ever seen inside one when you do a bloom, there's going to be a huge rush of gas coming out. It's going to bubble up with all this foam, and that's all that gas leaving. So if you've ever wondered why you're supposed to do a bloom, what's happening when the coffee is just sitting here, that's the most important part. If we don't do this, our water is going to just move through really quickly and not pull all the flavor out of the coffee that we want to get from it. So this step is crucially important to the quality of your final cup. So I passed the 45-second mark. I'm going to start pouring the rest of my water. In this case, using 720 grams of water, I'm not going to be able to pour all of it at once. I'm going to have to do 2 pours because it won't fit in the top of this Chemex here. So I'm going to pour in kind of slow circular motions. The feature that's really important about the scale is it has a flow rate meter on it. What that means is it's going to tell you how quickly you're pouring your water. And there's 2 dots on it that are going to tell you the most important points to stay between, which are going to be 2.5 grams per second to 6.5 grams per second. This is not like the most crucial thing you can learn about brewing coffee, but if you really want to like take that next step into how to brew it a little bit better, you want to kind of stay between those 2 rates. Otherwise, you're going to kind of overfill and the water can move through quicker than you want it to. So I poured about half of my water here. So I'm going to let it sit. Again, that flow rate meter just telling me how fast I should brew. So I slowed down a little bit at some points and let that speed go back down, and then sped up if it got a little bit too low, just to kind of moderate the flow of water in there. So as this brews, you might have noticed I was going in slow circular motions. That's incredibly important as well. That water is going to agitate the brew bed and turn up all those coffee grounds, which is going to create that motion that allows the water to extract a little bit better. We don't want to be swirling or stirring. That's going to cause too much extraction and might become a little bitter. But those slow, gentle circles is going to allow us to evenly brew through all the coffee. The one thing you want to avoid is pouring directly on the filter. What's going to happen if you do that is the water will actually bypass the grounds and go right into the bottom without actually brewing the coffee. So if you do that, you're going to end up with a bit of a weaker brew because some of your water is not actually extracting from the grounds properly. So now I'm just going to finish the rest of my brew water, just pouring in those nice slow circles. It doesn't matter exactly what you do. I like to do little circles around the perimeter. Some people do like figure eights. Some people do like the infinity sign. Some people do like stars. I don't know. You can do really whatever you want. You just want to be moving around, not sitting in one place because that'll create a divot in the bed, which again will make water go straight through without fully saturating all those grounds. So now that I'm done here, I'm going to let the coffee just draw down so it'll drip through for a while. On a Chemex, you want to see about 5 to 7 minutes on your final brew time. Again, it's not critically important. Flavor is the most important thing, not the time it takes to brew. So if it tastes good, you did the right thing. Last thing to look out for here is I mentioned that we want the 3-ply side on the side of the spout. And that's going to stop it from kind of folding in and stopping airflow. If at any point we see the brew start to stall, so we're seeing the water level not drop anymore, one thing we might check is if that spout has been clogged by the filter. If it has, I can kind of kick up my filter here a little bit and just turn it slightly. That'll move a new section of filter that's more flat in front of that so that it won't be blocking that anymore. At home, another thing you can do is put a chopstick in it. That'll kind of hold the filter back and allow air to keep moving through. So this will be delicious to taste later. This is our Malawi Sable Farms, which is going to be actually the coffee that is the oldest on this table. We've had this coffee since 2014. It's going to be actually our lowest grown coffee as well. So I'll talk a little bit more about elevation in a moment. But this is our lowest grown coffee, and it's going to have notes we're calling out of dark chocolate and ginger spice, which if you know African coffee in general, we usually call out florals and fruity flavors. In this case, we're talking about dark chocolate and ginger. This is a really interesting coffee that might be roasted slightly darker than you would expect for a lot of African coffees. But this one is really, really delicious, especially on a Chemex. The filter is going to pull out a lot of those oils and allow those more lighter, more delicate flavors to shine through. It's really, really delicious on this one. So while this draws down, I'm going to go ahead and start on my coffee press. So for the coffee press, you've probably seen one before. They're very simple. They have this metal filter. Some have like a basket type filter. There's all sorts of them, but they all kind of work the same. Like I said before, the Chemex is a version of a percolation coffee where the water is moving through the grounds. A coffee press is a full immersion brew. That means that all of the coffee and all of the water is brewing together for the entire process. There's not a point that some of the coffee is left while there's still some water in the grounds. So this will be a more full extraction and a more even extraction. It will also, being a metal filter in this case, not pull out all those oils like we talked about on the Chemex. This one is going to maintain a lot of those oils in there and allow some different flavors to show up. A coffee is not going to taste the same on both of these for a number of reasons. The percolation versus full immersion is one. The filter difference is going to be the more noticeable one for most people. So in this case, I'm going to use about 54 grams of coffee. I'm going to do a slightly stronger ratio here. So I'm going to actually do 1 to 15 in this coffee press. I'm also going to take my scale here, transfer it over. So this one, like I said, is going to be slightly stronger. That tends to lend itself to the profile of coffee press a little bit better, but it's really trial and error. The only set rule of coffee is that you should like the coffee you're drinking. So if you like a different ratio, do a different ratio. Do whatever you like. If you like cream and sugar, put cream and sugar in it. If you like black coffee, drink it black. If you like light roast, dark roast, drink what you like. That's the most important thing. This is just to help you maybe find what you like a little bit easier. So I have all of my 54 grams in here. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to get some hot water and pour it in. So it's not as hard with this one. There's not as much technique. Basically, I just want to get all the grounds wet and fill it full enough. So I'm going to start pouring. One question that comes up a lot that people have heard is, should you stir your coffee press? Generally, we say no, you shouldn't stir your coffee press because you don't really need extra agitation to help your extraction in a coffee press. Because like I said, all of the water and all of the coffee is hanging out together the entire time. It doesn't actually need any help. It's going to extract just fine. That said, if you don't have something nice where you can really coat all of your grounds evenly, stirring is going to allow you to coat all of them nicely and get them all saturated so they can extract more evenly. So if you need to stir, because you can't do quite what I'm doing here and move the water around, that's what you're going to want to do. So in that case, you'll want to stir, but you want to stir as little as possible, just kind of fold the grounds in. So I started the timer on this one. This is going to be a 4-minute brew. And a very important note is that that brew time starts as soon as the water hits the coffee, not when you filled it all the way up. Extraction starts as soon as the water has hit the coffee. So you want that first extraction to be your full time of your brew. Otherwise, you can end up with an over extracted brew, which tends to lend itself to more bitter flavors that people tend not to like. I also don't like super bitter coffee. So you'll want to keep it at 4 minutes from the time you first start pouring water. One thing I didn't touch on with the Chemex, so we can get into now while we wait for the coffee press, is how hot your water should be and also the quality of your water. We recommend generally 195 to 205 degrees Fahrenheit for brew water. That range is going to be basically if you boil a kettle on the stove, right when you take it off, you're going to hear that rolling boil. Let that calm down so you don't hear it anymore. And right about there is going to be the time that you want to start pouring. That's going to be right about your 205. If you want to get a little bit more granular than that, you should use hotter water for a lighter roast of coffee, and you should use colder water for a darker roast. Lighter roasted beans have not been roasted as long, therefore the beans are smaller and denser. That lends itself to a few things. One of them is they're harder to grind, so you oftentimes need to go a coarse or a finer grind on lighter roasted coffees. But you also need hotter water to extract as easily. Dark roasted coffees will extract way, way, way more easily than light roasted coffees. So if you put a 205-degree water on a really dark, let's say a French roast or an Italian roast, it's going to pull out that flavor really fast, and you can end up with those bitter flavors again that you might not like. It's not as important as some of the other things we talked about, the time, the grind, that kind of thing. Speaking of grind, this is a very coarse grind, pretty much the coarsest on any grinder. But that brewing range is going to be really helpful to make sure that you get it kind of in that sweet spot between a sour under extracted brew and a bitter over extracted brew. So 195 to 205. If you have a kettle, we sell the Fellow kettle at any of our Reserve locations. We have it here at the Empire State Building as well as the scale. That actually has a thermometer on it. We sold the stovetop version before. We now sell the electric version, so it plugs into a wall. You can set it right to the temperature you want, and it'll bring your water to that super fast every time. That's what I use at home. It's super nice. In this case, I'm using just hot water from a tap in another vessel. If you're going to do that, you aren't boiling this on a stove, you're transferring. What we recommend is that you warm up that vessel ahead of time so it doesn't pull too much heat out of your brew water. So if you put 205-degree water in a cold pouring kettle, that water is going to drop down to a much lower temperature very quickly as the temperature equalizes between the pouring kettle and the water. So warm it up first before you put water in it if you're going to handle it that way. Otherwise, if you're boiling it on the stove, it's fine the way it is. If you don't have a thermometer, again, just take it off at a boil, let it calm down until you don't hear it anymore, and then you're about good to start brewing. So we're just coming up on 4 minutes here. One important thing to note, you should never press your press on top of a scale. The load cells are pretty delicate. They can take a fair amount. Obviously, they're taking weight to weigh, but you don't want to put as much pressure as you would to push down a press on top of a scale. So number one, take your press off the scale before you do this. I'm at 4 minutes, so I'll stop that. And now I'm going to press. So what we're doing here, we're not squeezing the grounds. We're just separating them from the water. So you want to press pretty slowly. And when you get to the bottom, you don't want to really squeeze out the grounds. That'll release a lot of those really bitter acidic compounds that we don't want to taste. So we're going to get the grounds down to the bottom pretty slowly. Again, we don't want to increase the agitation at this point. When it's at the bottom, I'm just going to leave it be. I'm not going to squish it down or anything like that. It's good just like that. The filter is more, like it's called, to filter out the grounds, not to squeeze the grounds in any way. So this is more the way you would want to do it. And then it's ready to go. So all of this is good. A question that comes up a lot, and I'll preempt it, is how long can this sit for? Really, it can sit until it's cold. Coffee only extracts for so long. It's going to hit a point where it's not going to extract much anymore. And that's the 4-minute time. So it's not going to continue to extract very much. This can sit and it will be just fine. There'll be no problems with it until it gets cold pretty much. There will be a little bit more extraction as it sits, but nothing crazy. So this is good as it sits now. It could sit all the way through a meeting and still be good at the end as long as it's still hot. So and we generally recommend drinking coffee all through the temperature spectrum. So try when it's piping hot, try it when it's kind of mid temperature, and then try it cool. You'll get different flavors at every point in that. And that's how we actually come up with the tasting notes. So This is our newest coffee on the table. The tasting notes on the Sumatra Wahana Estate are going to be mulberry and cedar, which is a really interesting combination, especially for Asia Pacific coffee. Generally for Asia Pacific, we're looking for earthy notes, some dark chocolates, some nuttiness. But in this one, we're calling out mulberry and cedar, which is really interesting. That also highlights interesting processing methods used on this coffee. This is our highest grown coffee on the table. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about it, the elevation in just a minute. But this one is using all three of our most common processing methods. That's washed, semi-washed, and sun-dried coffee, all of a single varietal from the one estate, the Wahana farm. And they're all just, that one varietal is processed three different ways, mixed and brewed here. So it's coming up with some really interesting tasting notes, especially on our press, which is going to allow all the oils to kind of shine through, which is going to punch up some of those more chocolatey notes. It's going to punch up the sweetness, but it won't be quite as clean and clarified as a Chemex will. Last up here, I have our coffee from our own one and only Starbucks owned farm in Hacienda, Alsacia in Costa Rica. So we purchased this farm in 2013, but we first offered this decaf coffee in 2017. So this is kind of our staple decaf coffee in our reserve and roastery locations for Starbucks. And it's a really, really delicious coffee. We offer it on our espresso. We also do presses and chemexes of it, but it's really, really delicious. This is the one I'll point out to people if they think they don't like decaf or decaf can't be tasty. I point this coffee out to them because this is a delicious coffee. There's a few things we call out on it that you might not have heard before. One of those being sparkling acidity, because this is a really deliciously acidic coffee. And not acidic in the kind of like, oh, it's going to hurt my stomach way. When we talk about acidity, we're talking about the feeling in your mouth. So think about biting into a lemon or a more tart citrus fruit. The feeling of that in your mouth, not the flavor, but the feeling of that is going to be the acidity. So if it's more like that, it's going to be a higher acidity. If it's something more like the feeling of oatmeal or bananas, it's going to be a low acidity coffee. So we're calling out medium acidity on this one, but it's a nice, bright, pleasant, sparkling acidity. So today I have it brewed on espresso. I can't bring a whole espresso machine in here for you, but generally espresso is defined as brewing coffee under pressure. So that can be done with manually with a lever. It can be done with an automatic machine. You might have seen tamping and twisting in a portafilter and pulling coffee. This is pulled on our a version of our Starbucks Mastrena 2, which is the espresso machine you'll find in pretty much every Starbucks around the world. But this one is on a special version of it called our Oviso. It's basically taken that machine and moved it under the counter to allow espresso to be front and center in front of the customer. It allows us to put on more of a theater and a show where the espresso actually pulls from below instead of falling down into a cup. It actually rises into a vessel and then is poured into your cup. So it's a really interesting version of an espresso machine, and it brews a really tasty cup of coffee. So this is that Decaf Costa Rica. I'm going to try a little bit because it's really tasty. Right away, that acidity, the reason we put it on espresso, that sparkling acidity just really shines in the espresso format where you have a really concentrated brew. It can be, if you have a really acidic coffee that's not kind of a more pleasant acidity, a kind of carbonated beverage acidity like this one, it can be a little unpleasant and a little overpowering. This one is really delicious, which is part of it being also very high grown like the Sumatra here. Over 15,000 meters, this one's between 1350 and 1550, 1575, I think. You're going to find those more spicy, floral, fruity, and the better, more noticeable clarified acidity. Below around 1200 meters, which is about where we're going to find the Sumatra, is going to be sweet, smooth, and soft. And then over here, our Malawi is also around 1200 meters. This one, similar things, citrus, chocolate, vanilla. It's going to be a little nutty generally. And then the lower you go, they can still be sweet, but they're going to be a bit softer and smoother, and they might not have the clarity of flavor that you'd expect in a high-grown Arabica coffee. Generally, that's because the higher up, the colder the temperature, it's going to increase the maturation time of the coffee, which is going to allow the cherries to produce more sugars. And that sugar is going to produce that nice acidity, those bright floral and fruit flavors. And so those higher grown coffees are going to allow the plant to do that, whereas a lower grown coffee won't have that time to mature and build up all those natural sugars. So on the left here, I'm going to try this Malawi. First thing to do, very easy to clean up the pour over or Chemex, just lift the filter out and get rid of it. That's one of the best parts. Pour up just a little bit. The nice thing about this too is it makes a large batch, so you can share with friends and family, or you can drink it all yourself, which is what I normally do. Remember to always slurp your coffee. It's going to spray it across your palate and allow you to taste more of the flavor of that coffee. So here we're calling out a low acidity, and we're going to call it a medium body as well. So what we're looking for here is going to be very, very gentle on the tongue. It's not going to lay super heavy, but it's also not going to just wash away right away. We're talking about that body. Think about the difference between, say, a non-fat milk and a full fat or a whole milk or heavy cream. Those full or whole milk or heavy cream are going to sit on the tongue and feel really heavy, whereas that non-fat milk is more like water. It's going to leave right away. This is sitting right between those. It's very, very pleasant. That thick filter on the Chemex is also going to reduce the body a little bit. So it's going to be a little bit lighter than we'd see in, say, a press. Again, we're calling out dark chocolate and ginger spice. That's because this one's roasted a little bit darker than you'd see from a number of African coffees. But for a country like Malawi that's more landlocked and is growing at a bit of a lower elevation than something like Ethiopia that's growing over 2,000 meters and you're getting very floral coffees, the ginger spice in this is really, really punched up and it shows up really well in this slightly darker medium roasted coffee. And then last but not least, I have the Sumatra Wahana Estate. This is our newest coffee. Like I mentioned, we first offered it last year. So this is only the second time we've offered this coffee this year. It just came out. So you can get this in any of our roasteries around the country. So Seattle, Chicago, or New York City. And this is a really delicious coffee. Like I said, 3 different processing methods. So washed, semi-washed, which is unique to Sumatra, and then sun-dried, all of the same varietal blended together. And this one is a really delicious coffee. I loved it last year, and just this morning was my first time tasting it this year. And it is just as delicious, if not more. Coffee is an agricultural product, so it's going to change every single time you harvest it. But this one has shown up great last year and this year as well. So it's delicious. So again, we're calling out mulberry and cedar. This coffee press is really going to bring out those oils and really show us those bright fruit notes and the real nice sweetness that's going to show up, especially from the sun-dried coffee. So there's not a right way to brew any of these coffees or any of the coffees that you enjoy other than the way you like it. So this coffee would also be delicious on a Chemex. It's really just up to you. So it's really about experimenting. To me, that's the fun of coffee. I like to try it as many ways as I can, change little details about the grind and everything else, and just figure out the way that I think it tastes the best, playing around with coffee, honestly. So the fact that I get to do it for a job here at the Empire State Building is really, really cool. And it's, like I said, our National Coffee Day. I'm going to go home after this and play around with coffee myself in my house. So with that, I think we're going to go to some question and answers.
All right. I am back. Gray, that was amazing. I feel like I've learned so much. Now,
Thank you. Thank you.
now I know that my home brews will probably end up being a lot better following this event. And what a great way to celebrate National Coffee Day. We did end up getting a ton of awesome questions. So I will dive right in so we can answer as many as we can. The first question that we did receive was, what about wetting the filter when using an electric coffee maker? Is that something you would advise people to do?
I would say if you can, I would do it. I know a lot of times you want to set those at night and let it sit, and then in the morning it'll brew itself. If you have the time, what I would do is rinse the filter, set it in, and let it dry just a little bit before putting the coffee grounds in. If you put the coffee grounds in a soaking wet filter, it's going to do what I talked about with the press. It's going to start extracting right away, and you don't want that to happen all night. So if you have the time, rinse the filter, let it dry just a bit before you put the coffee in, and then you should be good to go. That will give you a better cup than putting it in dry. Although if you're leaving it overnight, you might not have the time. So if you have the time, do it.
Okay, it'll be like a little special treat if you do.
Yeah.
Is there a color that we should look for during the bloom when you're doing the pour over?
The color's going to change depending on your roast. So the answer is kind of no. You just want to see that foam. If you don't see all of that foam shooting out of the bed, that could mean 2 things. One of them is that your coffee might be a little stale. So if the coffee's been sitting around for a while, those gases naturally leave the beans as it sits and ages. That's why we give coffee an expiration date. We say unopened, or excuse me, opened whole beans of coffee are only really good for about 7 days, 7 days to 14 days. If they're not in a sealed container, that's because those gases are leaving on their own. So generally it means your beans have gone stale. It could also just be a really dark roast. Really dark roasts have already lost a lot of those gases in the roasting process, so they won't have as many in general. But color-wise, it's going to be lighter with a light roast and darker with a dark roast. There's not really a color you're looking for overall.
Okay, that's good to know. Now I know I'll be going to my
Yeah.
fridge after this to check on some of the coffees I have in there. And I know that you did mention this as you were doing the demonstration, but do you mind reminding us what the water temperature should be for the coffee for brewing them in these methods?
Absolutely, yeah. So we give a range of 195 to 205 degrees Fahrenheit. I'll let you convert that to Celsius. I don't know that off the top of my head, but generally just off the boil from the stove is what you want.
Okay, great. I think in Celsius that might be around 90 to 96, but someone can correct me if
I
I'm
do
wrong.
97 on my kettle at home, but I don't know exactly what that converts to.
Okay, that's perfect. And then someone asked, what's the point of a pour over if it's less immersion than other methods? Is it for people who want to try lighter coffees?
It could be. And generally, me and I know a number of people tend to prefer lighter roasted coffees on a pour over. What the filter in general is going to do for you, and I should say there are also metal pour over filters that will give you some of the oils that you get out of a press if you're looking for that kind of thing. But a pour over is going to give you a more clarified brew and flavors that are more distinct from each other. So you'll be able to pick out more flavors that are kind of unique from each other instead of it being more almost muddled together, not in a bad way, but it's a more separation of flavor in a pour over. And it's going to really let those brighter fruits and florals shine in a way that other processes won't.
I love that. I can't wait to try all of these different methods too, because I have a French press and I have an espresso machine, but I actually have never tried a pour over at home. So it's something that I am looking forward to doing now that I know
It's
of it.
very meditative. I do it every morning.
It seems like it is. And this is just another question, and I'm sure that it depends on how much you want to make, but how much coffee should be ground for the Chemex?
The Chemex, so there's a number of different sizes of Chemex. This is one of the larger sizes, and if you have one of the bigger Chemexes, you want to use more coffee, just because of the shape of the cone is going to change a little bit depending on the size. And the larger ones have a cone that suits a larger batch of coffee better. It's not super important. You can adjust it up and down. Like I said, we use 45 grams on this. This makes about an what is it, 800 milliliters ish of coffee. 720 is how much water we're using. So this is going to serve a few people for smaller cups of coffee. But you could go all the way down. You would just want to stick to the ratio. We said 1 to 16. 1 to 16, 1 to 17, 1 to 18. Those are all kind of normal ratios. So take however much coffee you want to use and then multiply it by 16 or 17. That should tell you how much water you can use. And you can go the other way as well. But you can really use whatever batch size you like.
Okay. So it's up to personal preference for some of it.
How much coffee you want.
Um, this is from a coffee master in training. What is your favorite food pairings for these reserve blends?
Ooh, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
So, for let's start with the one right in front of me, the Decaf Costa Rica Hacienda Alsacia. This is kind of an interesting one. I think one of the notes that got brought up in one of my classes teaching on this coffee one time is kind of a toast flavor. Think about like a toasted white bread in a really nice way. So we've paired this a number of times. We have a Princi sourdough loaf here at the Empire State Building and some of our other Reserve and Roastery locations. That with a little bit of our Partana olive oil on it actually pairs really, really nicely with this coffee because it has that a similar kind of toast flavor to it, as well as the spiciness of the olive oil. It actually shows up really well with the acidity in this one. For the, let's see, the Malawi. This one, when we have tried it, we've tried it with a number of things. We have a chocolate with a little bit of citrus zest in it. And that one we tend to pair with this one over some of the other coffees because the chocolate really mellows out some of the brighter flavors, but that citrus just pairs so nicely with the lower acidity of this coffee. The citrus kind of gives you the opposite end of the spectrum, right? So I think a nice citrus with this one or chocolate would be really good. And this one on our Sumatra, I actually have, let me tell you what we recommend. I have not paired food with this one personally, but I have our coffee card here that will give some wonderful recommendations. So we have coffee fact sheets available for these coffees for Starbucks partners. So for aspiring coffee master on the partner hub, you can find coffee fact sheets for all of these. I'm sure you know that. But for this flavor pairing, we're suggesting blueberries or soft cheeses. So the soft cheeses are going to go nicely with the little bit of acidity, especially from the sun-dried coffee in this one. And then blueberry is just going to fit so well with the mulberry we're already calling out in this coffee. So those should be great pairings with this one.
Wow. It's almost lunchtime. I'm very hungry now. I want to
Yeah,
try
me too. I
all
haven't
of
had lunch yet.
them. I especially am gravitating towards the decaf with the toast. So when I come to the Reserve store, I think that will be the one that I would gravitate towards. I want to try
Absolutely.
it now. I wish I had it in front of me.
I'll have a
Um,
little more.
oh, I'm jealous. You mentioned earlier in the demo that one of the coffees started being offered in 2014. So as a coffee consumer, what exactly does the age mean when consuming coffee or buying
Yeah,
coffee?
absolutely. So when we started offering this in 2014, that means the first time that we offered this one was in 2014. So these beans are not from 2014. The first time we offered this one was in 2014. So what that means generally is this coffee will probably have actually changed quite a bit since then. Like I mentioned, agricultural products will be different every time they're harvested. So this one is probably quite different than the first time we offered it, and we would call out different flavor notes from it. So one thing to take away from that is if you're drinking single origin coffees, which these all are, if you've had it like the year prior and then you say, "Hey, I love that coffee. Let me just go buy that one again." Look at the flavor notes that are being called out on it because it might actually have changed since the last time you had it. That's one of the most important things to know. If you're drinking blends, they tend to stay the same because the point of a blend is to create a flavor profile that you can then mix to every time you make it. Whereas these single origins are really highlighting what's special about these growing regions and the coffee beans, the varietals, whatever's happening there. So they're going to change. So if you're drinking these single origin coffees that have been around for a while, check them next time you buy them and see if they've maybe changed what's being tasted from last time.
That's great advice because I know I've bought the same thing over and over again year over year and have noticed subtle changes, but haven't really thought about it in that way. So I love to learn more about that. Um, Someone else asked, do you suggest a consumer purchase coffee and store it in the freezer? And if you do, why?
This question always comes up, so thank you for asking. I had to help my mom with this one recently, actually. So generally, we suggest you don't put your coffee in the fridge or freezer. What that's going to do is cause moisture to build up in the coffee. So if you have an unsealed bag of coffee, the example I always use is because this is what happened to my mom. She got a bag of coffee on her wedding day with my dad. She put it in the freezer because she wanted to have it like on their next anniversary. That's okay. If you need something like that, coffee does not last that long, even in a sealed bag sitting on your counter. If you want to keep it for a year, 2 years, 3 years, or something, leave it sealed. Please don't open it. Leave it sealed, and you can put it in the freezer. That will extend the shelf life. But once you take it out of the freezer, don't put it back in. Because as it warms back up, it's going to pull a lot of humidity in from the environment and is going to start to cause that oxidation of the beans to happen faster with that moisture. So don't take it in and out of the fridge or anything like that. It's one time in, one time out. If you want to keep one bag of coffee for a long time, but you want to drink it regularly, open that bag and put it into individually portioned Ziplocs for like a week each, as much coffee as you go through in a week, and then just take a Ziploc out every week. That's going to be your best bet if you need to keep it for a long time. But generally, we just recommend buy a new bag of coffee unless it's special.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's good advice. Someone else asked, would the temperature matter as much if you have a very fine ground as the surface area would be greater?
So it doesn't change as much in terms of the water temperature. The finer the grind, the faster it's going to extract on its own. Generally, like when we talk about brew time, anything that has a longer brew time, say a press at 4 minutes, or if we talk about cold brew, that usually sits for like 16 to 24 hours. That's going to be a very, very coarse grind. A finer grind is just going to happen faster, but the water temperature is still going to work the same way, just will do its job in that shorter period of time. So you still want the water temperature to be the same, just like for espresso, we're pulling with like 201-degree water, I believe, but it's happening in about 20 seconds. So it's just working along with that brew time and a very fine powder to brew at that fast speed.
Mm, that makes sense. And someone also asked, how many cups of coffee are you getting in each method that you did today?
It depends how you measure a cup.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. We usually say a cup is about 6 ounces is what we go by, but you'll also see 8 ounce cups. I've seen 10 ounce cups. So it's kind of how you measure a cup. Like I said, I don't know the calculation exactly, but the Chemex here, we're doing 720 grams of water. That's how much coffee is going to come out. So whatever that equates to in ounces, You can, whatever like cup size you feel like, it's going to change. The press here, we have about 800 grams of water, 810, I believe. So again, we can measure that out. And then an espresso is an espresso. So that's 1 cup.
And then someone also asked, what type of water is the best for coffee?
Yes, I mentioned water quality, but I didn't get into it in my demo. So water quality is often overlooked, but it's actually super, super important. If you think about it, this brew right here, this is about 99% water. Extraction only goes up to about 1 to 1.5% of the final brew actually being coffee particles. So when you think about it, water makes up the majority of what you're drinking. So if your water doesn't taste good, your coffee is also not going to taste good, it follows. So we generally recommend you can use something like a Brita, like a store-bought filter, is going to be your best easy method of having reliable water for coffee. In a pinch, this is not the sustainable choice, so I'm not recommending this, but you can buy bottled water. Bottled waters from the store are going to have about the same dissolved mineral content as that. The two things you don't want are one, tap water. If you live in an area with really hard water, it's going to have stuff like fluoride and chlorine and other minerals added to it that are going to affect the flavor of your coffee. And you also don't want distilled water. Distilled water is going to have zero minerals in it. And minerals actually help the extraction of the coffee and the final perception of both acidity and bitterness. So if you don't have those minerals dissolved in it, you're going to have a very flat brew without much acidity. It's going to be very unpleasant. If you get nerdier with it, like of course I do, there's a few companies that offer solutions specifically for coffee. Third Wave Water sells packs of minerals that you can add to distilled water to have the perfect mineral content every single time. That's what I do personally. And then there's companies that make water pitchers specifically for coffee as well. So you can go either way with it, but generally store-bought filter like a Brita will be perfect.
No, that works perfectly. And we have time for one more question. And this is something I am curious about too. So, what is a reserve store? If you could tell us more about that and specifically where you're working.
Absolutely. Yeah. So a reserve store is kind of like the flagship stores of Starbucks. Kind of, you're used to your neighborhood store, the heartbeat of our business that you find on just about every street corner in every city in the country because Starbucks is everywhere. What you might not see everywhere is a reserve store. And there's kind of two levels of it. There's reserve bars and reserve stores, which are kind of the core stores, your neighborhood stores that carry reserve coffees. So reserve coffees are going to be these ones like you see, they come in smaller packages. They're usually highlighting single origins or other rare and special coffees. And then there's kind of the roastery and more, and again, reserve. We don't have a different name for it, but a reserve similar to a roastery. So Empire State Building here is not a roastery store, but it's in the same flagship space as the roasteries are. We have this one here. We have one in Seattle at the headquarters called Soto Reserve. And then we also have one in Greenwich down near our New York roastery. So those are all kind of elevated reserve stores where we offer these reserve coffees and then unique experiences. You can see this whole wall of coffee cards behind me. So we offer all sorts of those things here. And then the other level I mentioned is roasteries. So those are the locations very similar to this one, but we also roast coffee there. So we have those all around the world. We have 6 of them in total currently. So we have Seattle, Chicago, and New York. And then we have Milan, we have Shanghai, and Tokyo. So those are our 6 around the world. Visit all of them. But yeah, in the US, Seattle, Chicago, and New York are going to be the ones like this store, but where they also roast coffee. You can see them demo and roast in front of you. You can see the beans shooting over your head. These ones in front of me were roasted at the New York roastery. So
That would
that's
actually be an epic vacation to try to visit every single one of those stores. That's something you should try to do,
yeah,
especially
globetrotting. I've been to all the US ones. I haven't been international yet.
right. So Shanghai, Tokyo, and Milan are next on the list.
Next up,
Okay. Well, I'll join you. I would love to go.
please.
Well, great. This was amazing and such an awesome way to celebrate National Coffee Day. I want to say a huge thank you for doing this and educating us more about coffee. I know that I'm walking away with a lot more knowledge than when I came in, and I'm excited to try all of these new techniques. And everyone, thank you for joining us today. And again, thank you, Gray, for educating us for National Coffee Day. As a reminder, you will be able to view a recap of this event in a few days on the Community Matter blogs at meetup.com/blog. There's also information in the chat about the Reserve store, about Starbucks, and generally about more information about what we talked about today. So Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and happy National Coffee Day. Gray, thank you, thank you, thank you. We'll see everyone soon.